In our last episode, we discussed how, after a string of victories for the British in the Southern Theater, General Charles Cornwallis now felt that the time was right to take the war into North Carolina and beyond. To do this, he hoped to successfully employ the Southern strategy, advancing north in a three-pronged attack to meet with British forces marching to the south, hoping to catch Washington in a pincher move and thus effectively end the Revolutionary War. But as he advanced to the north, he would need someone to guard his western flank, and the task of this fell to the young Major Patrick Ferguson, who not only defended Cornwallis's western flank, but also helped with the second part of the Southern strategy, which was recruiting and training Loyalist militia, turning them into a formidable fighting force. But his forces were not as formidable as he had hoped, for, as we see, that after the Battle of Waxhaw's, previously unconcerned backwoodsmen now began to band together their militias and provide a string of small but meaningful defeats to the British at Thickety Fort, Cedar Springs, and at Musgrove's Mill. And it was after the Battle of Musgrove's Mill that Patrick Ferguson, irritated with this harassment to his forces and supply lines, sent a letter to the overmountain communities that threatened to lay waste the country with fire and sword. Now, when the letter first arrived in the backwoods settlements, it reached the home of Isaac Shelby, who had also participated in the Battle of Musgrove's Mill. Riding 40 miles, he reached the home of John Sevier, and from there they sent out word to all the backwoods settlements to gather at the Sycamore Shoals near Fort Caswell. So while the men under the command of Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, William Campbell, and others are assembling outside of Fort Caswell, they are being generously supplied by locals with things that they desperately needed. They were provided with money for the trip, lead for ammunition, and the women would prepare food and clothing for the march that lay ahead. But in this time, as they're being generously supplied by the locals, there are two souls whose generosity stands out: Matthew Talbot and Mary Patton. Now, Matthew Talbot was one of the earlier settlers in the Watauga region, having moved with his wife and several children from Virginia and settled near the Watauga River. In 1776, his generosity came to light when, with the threat of a Cherokee attack, he offered his home as a means of protection to the nearby settlers. Connecting his house and outbuildings, he established Fort Caswell, more commonly known as Fort Watauga. Of course, Fort Caswell got its name from the governor of North Carolina at the time, Richard Caswell. But as we flash forward to the year 1780, we see that his generosity shows yet again when he delivers cattle to the overmountain men so they can make beef for the trip. But what about Mary Patton? Well, you see, Mary McKeon, her original name, was a native of England, and when her father moved the family from England to Pennsylvania in the 1760s, she learned from her father the art of gunpowder making. While there at the powder manufacturing plant in Pennsylvania, she met John Patton, and of course that ended up being her husband. From there, they continued to operate the gunpowder mill until the threat of a British invasion forced them to move further south into what is now Tennessee. And in fact, the place where they used to live is now referred to as Powder Branch Road. But now, in 1780, Mary Patton and the people of the backwoods are being faced with the threat of yet another British invasion, and it's at this point that Mary Patton has had enough. So she hitches up her wagon and goes over to Fort Caswell or Fort Watauga and to deliver 500 pounds of precious gunpowder to the overmountain forces. Thus amply supplied, the overmountain men are ready to march, but not before the Reverend Samuel Doak leads them in a sermon and a prayer, encouraging them to fight with the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Thus, with this encouragement, the backwoods band leaves Fort Watauga on September 26, 1780, to head down into the woods and defeat Ferguson. But almost as soon as they had left Fort Watauga, they began to encounter difficulties on their trip without even meeting the British, and that was the rain. The weather turned on them, and the rain was pouring, hampering and harrying their travel. So much so that they only made a few miles that day before they had to stop and camp at the Shelving Rock at the base of Roan Mountain. But the next day, they were yet again plagued by the weather because after they had got to the top of Roan and Yellow Mountains, they found that, well, the downpour had turned into freezing snow. Nonetheless, there was nothing for it, but they had to camp there on the top of the mountains that night, only to be plagued with another problem yet again. This seems to be a recurring theme throughout most of their march into the south, believe it or not. But the next morning when they woke up, they found that two of Sevier's men, Chambers and Crawford, had deserted. Unbeknownst to these men, well, they were loyalists, and they had deserted to go find Ferguson and inform him of the movements of the backwoods militia. But once they reached the base of the mountain, they found themselves split in two, quite literally, because the trail split in two. And so, not knowing which one to take for fear of being wrong, they split their forces, and at the end of it, when the road came back together, they met up and kept on riding down until they got to the home of Charles McDowell near Quaker Meadows. Despite the pouring rain, this ragged band of backwoodsmen, they were treated to as much generosity and hospitality as the McDowell family could muster, despite the pouring rain. However, we see that in this time, their spirits would not be dampened, because two scouts rode into camp with the electrifying news that Ferguson's camp had been spotted not more than 2 days' ride from their position at a place called Gilberttown. The next morning, they got up and rode over to Gilberttown as fast as they could, thundering across the Catawba River in hopes of catching the Bulldog napping. But when they arrived there, they found out that they were too late, for Ferguson had already abandoned that site for 2 days. At this point, they're rather unsure of what to do because they don't know where Ferguson's heading next. So the commanding officers chat amongst themselves, and they figure that if he's going to go anywhere, it's going to be south to Fort 96. As they were making their way down to the Green River, suddenly they come across Colonel Edward Lacey, who asks them where they're going. When they inform him that they're heading to Fort 96 to catch up with Ferguson, he tells them that they're wrong, because Ferguson is riding north to meet up with Cornwallis at Charlotte. Concerned with this news, they join Edward Lacey's forces and accompany him to Cowpens, where that day they helped themselves to a feast of toy cattle. And that very same night, they were encouraged yet again when their forces were bolstered by militia coming from Surry County, North Carolina, under the command of Major Joseph Winston and Benjamin Cleveland. But at this point, this militia starts to realize that their size is now becoming a liability. And so the leaders go through and pick out around 900 of the best men and horses that haven't been ridden into the ground. And therefore, they hope that with their reduced size, they'll be able to travel a lot faster and catch up with Ferguson. So throughout the night, they start riding on through the blinding, pouring rain. But when they reach the French Broad River, it poses a problem because the river is now swollen with the flooding. So in order to accomplish getting across without losing any men, they set their strongest horses downstream so that any of the unlucky souls who were washed out of the saddle would be able to hold on to the horses and thus prevent them from drowning. Thus, after everyone was safely across, they continued riding on until the next day, when they arrived at the home of these two old ladies from whom they hoped to possibly garner information as to Ferguson's whereabouts. Well, the problem was they were rather unsure as to how to go about getting this necessary information. But this is when a young man named Enoch Gilmer comes into play. His story and the rest of our story of the Battle of Kings Mountain will be concluded in our next Fun Fact Friday. Well, folks, this is Isaac White here at the Crockett Tavern Museum. I want to thank you so much for joining along for another Fun Fact Friday and learning more about the story of Kings Mountain. We want to thank you all so much for your support on Facebook and YouTube, but as always, the best support is by coming out to the Crockett Tavern and paying a visit. And as always, you know we have to do it, but our hours of operation as well as admissions will be listed in the description attached to this video. Until next week, this is Isaac White, signing off for now and saying goodbye and God bless.